Chapter 41. Kaylyn sighed as she stared at herself in the mirror for the third time since getting ready. She viewed her body at different angles, wanting to see the changes her body had made. Resting her hand on the mound, she smiled, thinking that it was getting bigger, that it was alive and possibly healthy. Kaylyn paused, with her hand still planted on her stomach, suddenly feeling a feeling of dread consume her. 1,000 what-ifs floated around in her head, none positive. As soon as the tears watered her eyes, Matthew entered the room. "Hey," he softly said as he moved towards her with his hands tucked in his pockets. Kaylyn turned quickly to him, his presence taking her by surprise. "Hi," she quickly replied, managing a smile. "You okay?" Kaylyn nodded. "Yeah, are you ready to go?" She cleared her throat. "Just about," he confirmed as he moved behind her. "Kaylyn, everything will be fine, you know," he reassured softly. "Yeah. I want to believe that," she said before her voice turned to a whisper. "I want to believe that so much." Placing his hands on her shoulder from behind, Matthew gently massaged to ease the tension. "You should believe it." Kaylyn slowly turned to him, their faces mere inches apart. "I'm just scared," she confessed softly. Using his thumb to wipe away the tear that spilled from her eyes, Matthew took his time to caress the softness of her cheeks, after which pulling her into his arms. "We'll be fine," he whispered. Kaylyn laid on the bed as she waited for the doctor to examine her. Matthew was at her side, her reassurance that everything would be okay, or at least he created the illusion that everything would be. The doctor suddenly entered with a clipboard in hand and a smile on his face. "Mr. and Mrs. Mayhew, it's nice to see you again," he greeted. They both began to correct. He chuckled. "It's okay, I know," he winked as he moved closer to Kaylyn. Kaylyn and Matthew both glanced at each other, managing an awkward smile. Dr. Evans reached for his gloves and placed it on his hands with the smile still on his face. "I hope you are still taking the medication I prescribed," he announced, his gaze warning. "Yes, I have been," Kaylyn assured. "Good, and has there been any spotting?" he asked as he reached for the equipment needed to execute the examination. Kaylyn cleared her throat, ignoring Matthew's eyes, which had settled on her. "A bit, at times," she informed. Before Matthew could utter a word, Dr. Evans spoke. "Pink, red?" Pink." "What spotting?" Matthew finally blurted. "It's quite normal during pregnancy." "Had it been red or heavy, it would have been serious," he provided firmly. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" Matthew asked in disbelief. "I didn't want to worry you, and plus I did my research and found that it was okay." Matthew scoffed, finding it hard to believe that Kaylyn hadn't told him about it, but he remained quiet, wanting to seem unaffected by the information he had received. Within seconds, a small amount of gel was placed on her naked stomach and spread with the transducer, which showed the activity of the fetus. Once again, Kaylyn was captivated by the knowledge of the life within her. This time she could make out areas without the doctor having to show her. She smiled joyfully as her eyes watered with a similar emotion. Matthew, long forgetting the tension he had felt just moments ago, grinned as he feasted his eyes upon the monitor. Subconsciously, he reached for Kaylyn's hands and gripped it tightly in his. "The baby's heartbeat is steady. He sounds healthy." He smiled as he moved the device on and around Kaylyn's stomach. There was a small silence, both parents eagerly awaiting the "but that would come next." "However, I'm afraid there is no improvement to the condition," he let out, softly, yet firm. "The placenta is now completely covering the cervix, so I'm afraid you'll have to do a cesarean section with childbirth. There's a likely chance that the placenta can migrate within that time, but with a complete previa a C-section is the most likely alternative for birth," he informed formally, making sure to maintain eye contact. Kaylyn's lips trembled and her eyes burned with the grief that pushed at her throat. Her grip loosened on Matthew's hand, an indication of the hope lost. "So, what's the risk if this thing is still there?" Dr. Evans cleared his throat. Hemorrhaging may occur closer to the due date and premature, thank you, Matthew cut in, not wanting to hear anything else. I'm recommending complete bed rest at this time. No vigorous activities or anything that could put a strain on the pelvic area, he continued as he wiped the gel from her stomach. Do you want to know the sex of the baby, or do you still want to keep it unknown? The doctor asked. Matthew glanced at Kaylyn, only then realizing that tears were streaming down her face, but yet, her face was void of emotions. Matthew swallowed hard. No, we'd still like to keep it unknown, he bit out in a strained tone. Dr. Evans smiled tightly as he watched them both, knowing the magnitude of hurt that the couple would be feeling. In his line of work, he had encountered many couples, and although the news was sometimes good, he hated being the bearer of the bad ones. As he watched the couple, Dr. Evans was able to sense the tension, but he could also see that however long they planned on going, they would make it. He suddenly began to write something on a piece of paper, his glasses comfortably sitting on the bridge of his nose. I'm prescribing some more medications for you to take in the mornings after you've eaten breakfast. He continued to talk amidst the disappointment he noticed in their eyes after taking a stop at the drugstore. The drive home was silent. Kaylyn blankly stared out the window with her hands folded in her lap and her thoughts in a jumble. Seeing how distant she had gone, Matthew lightly sighed as he momentarily glanced in her direction. He knew she was tensed, he knew she was heartbroken by the news, but her silence was driving him crazy. He wanted to know what she was feeling, he wanted to know what was going on in her head. Kaylyn, he began, seeing how she suddenly began to fidget and look further out the window. Talk to me, please, he completed softly. Silence. Seeing that his efforts were failing, Matthew closed his mouth, refusing to utter another word. They drove for a few more minutes before Kaylyn spoke. Stop here, she requested disjointedly, pointing towards an electronics store. Matthew parked before asking, What do you want here? He asked curiously, settling his gaze on her. He finally saw how expressionless and blank her face was. Matthew clenched his teeth and swallowed hard to control his emotions. I need a new charger, she informed stoically as she pushed the door open. Matthew watched until she disappeared from his line of sight. Muttering a curse, he slammed his hand frustratingly against the steering and raked his hand through his hair. He rested his head against the car seat, as he allowed his thoughts to overwhelm him. He understood what she was going through, what she had gone through all her life, but heck, if she only gave him a chance, he'd make her happy. He would make things right. A few minutes, buried in deep thought, Kaylyn re-entered the vehicle with a shopping bag in hand. She sat without a word, her gaze narrowed pointedly in front of her. Never once did she momentarily glance at Matthew or say a word. Matthew started the car as they drove home in silence. They arrived home few minutes later with the welcome of an empty house. Before Matthew could utter a word to Kaylyn, she was already climbing the stairs headed to her room. Matthew sighed, knowing that she needed the time to compose herself and properly digest everything. Kaylyn went to the nursery they had surprised her with. She smiled shakily, running her hands along the smooth, furnished crib as she moved towards a chair in the far corner of the room. Taking the video camera she had purchased from her bag, she turned it on and positioned it before her as she sat. She cleared her throat and used her hand to tuck in a lock of loose hair behind her ear. Couple seconds passed with the video still recording and Kaylyn thinking about what she was about to do. But then she was reminded of the fact that in just a few months, she may or may not see her child. She could die giving birth and her child may not get to see her, to know her. With just that very thought, tears watered her eyes, but she sniffed and sighed heavily before she began. Hi, she began shakily, tightly closing her eyes and composing herself with the courage to continue. Seeing how distant she had gone, I don't know if you'll be a boy or girl. Your father Matthew and I wanted it to be a surprise, but it doesn't matter because we'll love you. Just the same, she sniffed. I want you to be happy and live and love like it's your last day on earth. Be strong and be proud of whatever you do, she cried, quickly brushing away the tears. No matter what happens, I want you to know that I'll always love you and there are people who'll always love you. You'll have the best father on this earth who'll love you and care for you. He may seem tough at first, but he really has a golden heart. And your sister? Kaylyn trailed off, not being able to control the heavy emotions that pushed against her throat, against her heart. She'll be the best you could ever ask for. She'll make you laugh when you're sad and she'll always be there whenever you need her. She managed a shaky smile, remembering all the times Sapphire had been there for her. And then there's Faith. She's your mommy's best friend, and even though she comes across harsh sometimes, she really has your best interest at heart. She really lives up to her name, she smiled shakily. There's also my daddy who, even though he's weak in body, his heart is strong. I want you to make him feel loved and cherished, as I know he'll make you feel the same. I'm saying all this to say, you won't ever be short on love, and if you ever feel like you are, I want you to remember this. Remember me. She began to sob, not being able to stop it this time. You'll always be in my heart no matter what, she exclaimed, between sobs. Kaylyn, what are you doing? Matthew interrupted from the doorway. Kaylyn tightly closed her eyes, her heart breaking further. Matthew gasped upon seeing the video camera. It was all he needed to figure out what was going on. He swallowed hard as he strolled towards her. Stop this. He hissed as he turned the camera off. No. She shrieked hysterically, stumbling forward to turn it back on. I have to do this. I need to, she cried. Matthew grabbed her hands and twirled her to him. The baby won't need a video when you'll be there holding him or her in your hands in just a couple months. Matthew exclaimed shakily. I don't know that, she croaked as the tears streamed down her face. We don't know that, Matthew. I need my baby to know who its mother is. I may not be here for him to see. She cried. You will be here, Matthew insisted firmly as he glowered into her misty gray eyes. Why can't you understand? She yelled. I need to do this, I don't know what will happen to me, and neither do you. I could die, Matthew. Do you even know what the very thought of that is doing to my heart? She questioned sorrowfully, as she gazed into his eyes, seeing that he had also gone sad. And do you know what this is doing to mine? He bit out abruptly, and then realizing what he was saying, he turned and raked his hand through his hair. Kaylyn, he began, firmly holding her shoulders. I'm scared as much as you are, believe it or not. I fear a repeat of Marcia's situation, but I'm holding on to hope. He explained with his face flustered and hair ruffled above his watery eyes. I don't know what I'll do if I lose you. I'm scared out of my mind, but I'm being strong for my family, I'm being strong for you, he whispered softly, blinking back the stinging in his eyes. A heavy sob broke loose from Kaylyn's lips, and without a thought, she brought her head down to Matthew's chest. I'm scared, she confessed, crying. Matthew held her closely to him as he used a hand to massage her head. We'll be fine, I promise. We'll be fine, he reassured, wanting so much for his words to be true. He hoped for them to be, even though hope seemed lost. Chapter 42. Being in bed every single day was driving Kaylyn crazy. She wanted to move around, go out, do something. But of course she knew that it was for her own good, and with an insistent Sapphire and Matthew, she knew she was trapped anyway. With only 2 months remaining, Kaylyn dreaded and anticipated the day at the same time. Over the past weeks, she had blocked her thoughts from thinking about anything negative. She now strongly believed that they would both make it out all right. She had the support to back it up. Kaylyn reached for the photo album on the nightstand, royal blue with pink daisies framing the edges. She smiled as she opened it, the first picture welcoming her. It was a sonogram of the baby, which the doctor had given her weeks ago. Kaylyn smiled, contentedly, using her fingers to slowly trail across the image. We'll be meeting each other soon, she whispered, then placed a kiss on the photo, her free hand resting on her stomach. Hey, you okay? A voice asked from the doorway. Kaylyn looked up to find Matthew with a smile on his face. Kaylyn nodded. Yeah, I was just looking at the sonogram, again, she grinned. Matthew chuckled as he moved towards her. You'll see a more beautiful version in just 2 months' time, He wiggled his brows as he sat beside her. Yes, I will. Your dad is coming up shortly, he announced, seeing the way Kaylyn suddenly perked up. Sapphire is showing him some things we've brought. Kaylyn gaped at him. Matthew, for the last time. She expelled breathlessly. The baby doesn't need anything else. We already have things that can't even fit into the nursery, she pointed out, looking up at him in disbelief. We'll find space, he gave a cheeky smile. I have the money to spoil you guys, so let me. He placed a kiss on her forehead and stood. Kaylyn smiled, watching him retreat from the room. He paused at the door. Sapphire and I are going to prepare lunch. Any suggestions? Nah, I'm good with anything, she assured, smiling when Matthew winked before leaving. Kaylyn smiled contentedly as she rested her head against the soft cushions, thinking of how caring Matthew had become in the past months. At one point she didn't think it was possible, but she was proven wrong. He was everything she could ever wish for in a man, a father to her child. Well, Miss Kaylyn Fisher, you may want to wipe that look off your face, otherwise someone will think you're in love, Patrick teased as he entered the room with a smile. Kaylyn chuckled, ignoring the tease. Hey Dad, she announced brightly. Patrick smiled as he moved towards her and sat on the edge of the bed. How are you doing today? Great. Kaylyn announced. Patrick was happy with the news. I can see that, he acknowledged softly. Kaylyn slightly hung her head to conceal the blush that tainted her cheeks. I'm happy, Dad, she admitted coolly. Patrick nodded knowledgeably. You can't imagine how happy I am to hear that, but I could see it on your face all along, he smiled. You deserve to be happy, sweetheart. Kaylyn smiled her thanks, floating in the small silence that followed. How are you, Dad? Patrick heaved a sigh. I'm alive, he joked, then chuckled. I'm hanging in there, sweetheart, he said as he reached for Kaylyn's hand. I'm hanging in there, he repeated with a slight squeeze. Kaylyn smiled. You really want to see your grandbaby, don't you? She asked huskily. As much as I wanted to see you when I found out your mom was pregnant, he retorted amusingly. Another small silence fell between them. I'm inviting you guys to dinner on the weekend. You, Matthew, Sapphire and Faith, he informed. I want us to celebrate life and happiness. Kaylyn didn't like the tone in his voice. His words were warming, but somehow they weren't reassuring. He spoke about life like it was about to be taken from him any minute. Was it? She wasn't sure, because he concealed what he was really feeling beneath his smile. She swallowed. Dad, are you sure you're okay? She asked him, meeting his gaze. Of course, honey. Daddy, you can tell me what's going on. Don't keep things from me, just because you don't want to see me sad, she implored. Kaylyn, I'm fine. Trust me, he insisted with another gentle squeeze. She peered at him for some passing seconds in deep scrutiny, wanting to confirm that he was indeed okay. He didn't look bad, she had to admit. His color seemed bright and healthy. She hoped it wasn't her paranoia. She then grinned. Okay, dinner sounds awesome. It might do me some good being out of the house for a while. Patrick managed a smile as he glanced upon his beaming daughter. He was glad to see her finally happy. He had taken that away years ago, but luckily she found Matthew and Sapphire who would love her unconditionally. Even when he was gone. Okay. You choose. Kaylyn exclaimed in defeat a few hours later as she argued with Sapphire about what movies to watch. Yes. Sapphire rejoiced triumphantly. Frozen. Kaylyn laughed. We've already watched that 3 times since I've been here, she said in disbelief, momentarily glancing at Matthew, who just sat smiling. But it makes us laugh, she defended. Kaylyn smiled. Okay, fine. Frozen it is. She exclaimed brightly before bringing her voice down to a murmur. For the 4th time. Sapphire grinned and rubbed her hand together in anticipation, but she then momentarily paused, glancing at Matthew. Daddy, is the pop-pity corn ready? She asked, twisting her mouth. Matthew suddenly jolted from the armrest of the sofa and moved towards the kitchen. Coming right up, he called. Sapphire shook her head and heaved a sigh. He's forgetting things already, she hissed flatly. Kaylyn laughed aloud and Sapphire joined in, snuggling up to Kaylyn as the movie began. Kaylyn placed her arm around her shoulders and pulled her closer. Matthew later joined with a bowl of popcorn and a bottle of juice. Okay people, move over, he exclaimed, hearing Sapphire's giggle. They scooted over, allowing Matthew space on the sofa. Matthew placed the food on the coffee table and snuggled beneath the blanket beside Kaylyn. I bet I can recite each line without making a mistake, Matthew whispered in Kaylyn's ear. She giggled, knowing she could probably do the same. But for Sapphire's sake, they watched and enjoyed. For the fourth time. Chapter 43. This one, or this one? Sapphire asked Kaylyn, holding up two dresses in both hands. One was a pretty little royal blue with cream frills at the end and sleeves, with a band at the waist. Meanwhile, the other was a soft yellow with the same design. Kaylyn pretended to be in deep thought but knew her mind was already made up with just a glimpse at the two options. I like the blue one, she finally said. Sapphire smiled. Me too. Kaylyn smiled, rummaging through her things for a dress herself. The weekend had arrived, which meant it was time for the dinner they all had anticipated. Kaylyn awaited the moment when she would sit, eat and talk, in the company of those she loved most. She smiled when she came upon a light green maternal dress Faith had bought for her some weeks ago. It would go well with your fiery red hair, she had said, and of course, after trying it, Kaylyn had found that she was right. Oh, that's a pretty dress, Sapphire beamed, halting Kaylyn from her thoughts. I'm glad you like it. I plan on wearing it tonight, she informed cheerfully. Yay. We'll both look pretty, she grinned. We definitely will. Patrick glanced at himself in the mirror, displeased with ashen color in his face. His eyes seemed deep with dark circles and his hair thinned out more by the day. He coughed as he reached for the lip balm and patted his lips to treat the dryness. Lately, he had found that a little makeup could return his original color and hide a few dark circles. He knew it was wrong of him to create an illusion that everything was fine, when they clearly weren't, but he couldn't allow his daughter to be saddened by his situation. The joy was back in her eyes, she was happy given her circumstances, and Patrick knew he could never take that away from her, again. He didn't think he'd live to see the baby before the delivery. He knew he wouldn't. He knew 2 months was a long time for him to continue living, and although it twisted his heart to know that he wouldn't see his grandchild, he knew someday he would. Patrick took a seat on the bed, not being able to stand for so long. He was so weak. His phone began to ring, and unhesitatingly he pulled it from his pocket. Lilith's number popped up on the screen. Patrick sighed. Hello, he answered. So, you've now forgotten me? She asked dryly. Lilith, he began tiringly, you've already made it clear that you don't want to be a part of Kaylyn's life. I didn't say I didn't want to be a part of yours, she pointed out firmly. It means the same thing to me, Lilith. I want the time I have left with my daughter, he expelled softly. The time you have left, Patrick, what are you talking about? She demanded. Patrick briefly closed his eyes. I called you few months back to tell you I was dying and you shrugged me off like an old shoe. I then realized, Lilith, that you only have love for yourself and power, he snarled bitterly. A small silence followed, Patrick continued. I have spent some time with my daughter and surprisingly, I realized that for quite some time I had forgotten what happiness was until I saw her again, he chuckled. Patrick, I might not see you again, Lilith, and I'm sorry that things weren't different, but that was your decision to make. I'm happy, because my baby girl is happy, he smiled at the last bit. I might not get to see my grandchild, but I know that he will know me. Kaylyn will let him or her know me, but the irony of it all is. He trailed off and forced out a strained laugh. While you have breath, you will be dead to them, and while I rot, I will continue to live. Goodbye Lilith, he completed before disconnecting the call. He sighed heavily, a smile replacing the scowl when he thought of the night ahead. Matthew and Sapphire waited downstairs for Kaylyn to come down so they could leave. Daddy, do you think this dress makes me look fat? Sapphire asked as she looked down on herself from different angles. Matthew chuckled. It's perfect, he reassured, pinching her on the cheek. Who combed your hair by the way? He then asked, noticing the neat ponytail with the ribbon on top. Sapphire beamed. Kaylyn did it, who else? A knock sounded at the door, breaking their conversation. That must be Faith, Sapphire informed as she moved towards the door. She said she would drive with us to the restraint, she provided, getting the information from the conversation she had overheard while Kaylyn was on the phone. Faith entered in a sparkly red dress that brushed against the top of her knees, fitting her body like a glove and enhancing the little curves she had. Her hair was loose, shiny blonde curds spilling over her shoulders in soft waves. She clutched at a small purse in her hand as she nervously cleared her throat. Hey, she greeted. Daddy, can I wear some of Faith's lipstick? Sapphire exclaimed before Matthew could utter a greeting. Matthew glanced at Faith's blood-red lips. No, came the abrupt answer. Sapphire pouted. Matthew glanced at his watch. What's taking Kaylyn, he began, but cut himself off when he saw her descending the stairs. Matthew sucked in a breath as he watched her angelic movements, carefully making her way down. Her hair bounced lightly with every movement, trailing down her shoulders and almost to her waist, with soft curls at the ends. The fiery orange seemed as if they had become aflame when the lights above hit it, and all Matthew could see was a waterfall of molten lava with sparks of fiery blonde at areas where the light settled most. It created a halo for the straight face that was harnessed beneath, kissed with neutral colors of minimal makeup and peach-pink lips that were made to be cherished. Her bare ivory arms were out, looking as flawless as the word, with her slender fingers trailing along the length of the rails that Matthew immediately envied. As his eyes consumed the length of her, he was lastly left to feast his hungry eyes on the silk-looking dress that caressed and clung to her body, emphasizing a figure Matthew didn't know pregnant woman had. Kaylyn had it, and she embraced it with one hand resting on her stomach, a stomach that almost seemed invisible with the making of the dress. He couldn't resist the smile that tugged at his lips, and how could he not smile when he was faced with such beauty? And no, not beauty, it seemed too much of an understatement to describe what Kaylyn really was. Sapphire, seeing how phased out her father had become, nudged Faith in the side and they shared a giggle. Kaylyn met Matthew's gaze, her cheeks warming when she saw the way he was looking at her. She smiled. Is everyone ready? You all look so nice, she complimented. You look the nicest, Sapphire smiled. Doesn't she, Daddy? Without giving it a thought, Matthew replied, definitely. Sapphire giggled. Kaylyn, seeing what she was up to, smiled and shook her head. Well, let's go then, she announced, and they all agreed, grabbing keys, purses, etc. As soon as they reached the door, Kaylyn paused. Damn, I forgot my phone, she hissed, immediately turning around. You guys can go ahead, I'll be out shortly, she called out as she walked briskly towards the stairs. Matthew watched as she began to climb the stairs. Seeing that they were already late, he decided to go for the car and drive it out of the garage and towards the front. He did so, and they waited patiently for Kaylyn to return, Matthew finding it strange that she took so long just to retrieve a phone. Maybe she went to the bathroom, he later thought, but when was past 5 minutes, and there was no sign of her, he grew worried. He glanced at Faith and realized that she too looked worried. Matthew swallowed hard when his heart began to plummet, and unhesitatingly, he pushed the door open and got out. He heard the door slam behind him, and so he knew that Sapphire and Faith too had emerged from the vehicle. Kaylyn, Matthew called, moving briskly up the stairs. Silence. Matthew grew breathless with the sharp hammering of his heart against his rib cage. He increased his pace, almost running until he reached the top of the stairs. Kaylyn. He called once more, and silence was the reply. Matthew dashed across the floor to her room and pulled the door open. Nothing in his life could have prepared him for what he saw. His sharp intakes of breath were the only thing he could hear. The world stilled as his eyes focused on Kaylyn's blade across the floor and laying in a pool of blood. Matthew's eyes widened, his body seemingly paralyzed as he stared ahead. He heard a scream, but he didn't recognize from who it came. "Kaylyn," he whispered, and all of a sudden the world started spinning and sounds began to fill his ears again. Matthew gasped, dashing towards her when his senses returned. He slid in her blood and held her face, trying to get a reaction, but nothing. Flashing his head violently towards the door, he saw Faith, who was frozen with shock, and Sapphire, who had fell to her knees as she wailed. Matthew's vision blurred. He blinked. Tears fell. "Call an ambulance now," he yelled, then refocused his gaze at Kaylyn, who had gone pale, with her blood seeping through his suit. Chapter 44. Matthew ran blindly behind the gurney with Kaylyn's body splayed stiffly across. Doctors were walking briskly at her side, muttering incoherent syllables Matthew could not process. And even if he tried to, it would be a hard task because his thoughts were flying frantically around in his head, unsure of a solid foundation in which to land. His thoughts were chaotic, his body was numb. He felt useless. But just like the doctors, he walked alongside the bed, clutching her hand in his and reassuring himself that all would be fine. The tears created a dam in his eyes, waiting on the permission of a blink to fall, to flood his face and attempt at drowning his sorrows. And so he let it fall, knowing it was bound to. Everything will be fine, I want you to know that, Kaylyn. I want you to be strong," he muttered against her ear, while placing a kiss on her ashen forehead. "Blood pressure is a bit high. We need to prepare her for surgery now," a doctor exclaimed, and just like that everything crashed into Matthew. The chattering, the wheels running along the tiles, the cling of equipment. Matthew sucked in a breath, and in that instant he could feel how hard his heart hammered against his chest. A hand was suddenly placed on, barring him off. "Sir, you need to stay out here," one doctor told him firmly. I need to be with her," he explained, still moving with Kaylyn. "You can't be in here," the doctor exclaimed again. Just like that. The gurney turned a small corner and Kaylyn's hand slipped from his. His heart tightened suddenly, and just as he was about to go after her, a door closed in his face. "We'll keep you updated, but for now you just have to be patient while we make your wife better," the doctor consoled, placing a reassuring hand on Matthew's shoulder before she disappeared into the room. Matthew leaned against the cold wall, sliding to the floor as sobs broke away from him. When he was sitting on the hard surface with his knees to his chest and his head resting against them, it brought back a feeling of déjà vu. "I'm fine, Matt," was what Marcia had weakly said when her first contraction had resulted in Matthew rushing her to the hospital. Matthew had been so confident in her words that her death had come as an absolute shock to him. It was until he had seen her body that the truth resonated with him. Now here he was, placed in a similar situation, but this time he felt worse, because he was more connected to Kaylyn. With the possibility of death hanging over him like a dark cloud, Matthew couldn't help but feel lost at the prospect. But he also knew he had to hold on to that small kindle of hope that told him everything was going to be okay. It had to be. Still on the floor with the tears flowing from his face, he used the back of his hand to uselessly wipe away the tears from his face, but in that process, he also recognized that his hand was still stained with blood. Kaylyn's blood. His hand suddenly began to tremble, but another hand was suddenly placed on his in reassurance. Faith hovered over him, with a flushed face and red and puffy eyes. Matthew sniffed and swallowed hard, reminding himself that there were other people who needed him. Wordlessly, Faith stooped beside him, clutching his bloodied hands in hers. Her lips trembled and her eyes watered, but still she managed a shaky smile. "She's strong," she croaked, nodding her head profusely to convince herself of the words she spoke. Matthew tightly clenched his teeth and averted his gaze, wanting something to distract him from another sad person. However true Faith's words were, he still had to worry. "She's a fighter, and that's what she'll do today." "I know she will." Faith trailed off and placed a hand at her mouth to stop herself from crying. With a blurry glance, Matthew nodded, knowing that he was too weak for words. And for some passing seconds, they sat there until he finally decided to say something. She's with your parents. I called them to be with her. She wouldn't stop crying and... Thank you, Matthew managed as he began to stand. With rugged hair, a flushed face and a breaking heart, Matthew looked at Faith. My hands, he held them up, before walking aimlessly through the halls, in search of a bathroom. When he was alone, his face to the mirror and the sink being his support, Matthew fixated his gaze on the person staring back at him. And all of a sudden, his thoughts took him back to the past. I'll be fine, Matt. I'm scared. We'll be fine, I promise. We'll be fine. Marcia's words, Kaylyn's words, his words. They all came rushing back to him like a tidal wave, ready to topple him over. The tears of sadness began to stream down Matthew's face again, and the words kept replicating in his head, wanting to drown him in more sorrow. With a yell, Matthew slammed his fist in the mirror and the glass before him shattered, the pieces making distorted versions of him, while his heart felt the way the glasses looked. His sobs then came out short and raspy, but soon a hand was wrapped around his shoulder in comfort. John Mayhew took his son in his arms and allowed him to cry against his shoulder. He had been there for Matthew with Marcia, and now he knew he needed to be there for him with Kaylyn. Everything will be fine, my boy, he reassured gently, feeling his own eyes burn with the impendent tears, but knew he had to be strong for his son. Matthew and John joined the others in the waiting area some minutes later. His mother's sadness was evident, even more so when she saw Matthew approaching her. If it wasn't for a sleeping Sapphire in her arms, she would run to him, but the love that exuded from her eyes was enough reassurance Matthew needed. Matthew's gaze drifted to the side where he saw Patrick hugging his shoulders. His eyes were red, his face flushed, his body frail. Matthew slowly walked towards the man in his jacket dressed for a dinner that was long forgotten. Seeing Matthew approaching him, Patrick's eyes glistened with tears. Slowly Matthew moved forward and pulled him in for a hug. Patrick's body trembled momentarily, but he quickly regained his composure. My baby girl is not a quitter, Matthew, I know that. Matthew nodded with a sniff, after which pulling apart and patting Patrick on the back. Matthew didn't realize sitting was such a hard task until he was placed in the situation where sitting was all he could do. He wanted to distract himself, he wanted something that would take his mind off the situation, but he could do nothing but sit with his hands on his knees, while his legs shook nervously. Sapphire had fallen asleep in her grandmother's arms, drained from the task of crying for so long. Faith was pacing back and forth, her eyes fixated on the entrance the doctor would come through to give them the news they long awaited for. Patrick and John Mayhew was conversing silently in a far corner, with John's hand placed reassuringly on Patrick's shoulder. Matthew didn't want to look for long, he didn't want to see so much sadness, and so he rested his gaze blankly on the off-white tiles. Minutes passed with the same driving silence and dreadful anticipation. Matthew thought he'd go insane. He wanted to hear something. He wanted news about Kaylyn and the baby. Currently, he thought that if it was between two choices, he'd choose Kaylyn. Kaylyn would probably give them other babies they'd adopt even, but a baby could not give him another Kaylyn. He pleaded in his mind for her survival. He didn't know what he would do if she died. She had grown to be too important for him. He would lose himself if he lost her. Tears pricked his eyes again, but before they fell, a hand was laid on his shoulder. Matthew looked up to find his dad. Son, we're going to pray, he informed softly. Matthew was hesitant, but then he sat up, deciding that he would. They held hands in a small circle. Matthew held Patrick's, and despite the frailness his body possessed, he still found the strength to squeeze Matthew's hand in comfort. Matthew smiled, thinking that if such a weak man carried hope, then why couldn't he? Lord, you know our reason for calling upon you today. John began. Matthew's throat tightened as he closed his eyes. For a minute, the prayer continued, and as soon as they pulled apart with the belief that God would work in their favor, a doctor arrived. Matthew jumped out of his chair and moved towards the man. Soon after, the man in blue scrubs was surrounded by an eager family. The surgery was successful. He saw that they still held their breaths, and so he continued. The baby's oxygen supply was low, and he's a bit premature, but he's all right. We have him incubated for now. He should be fine with time, he smiled. So it's a he? John laughed. The doctor nodded. Matthew sighed heavily but knew that he couldn't be completely happy just yet, although the news of the baby was refreshing. What about Kaylyn? Is she okay? Can we see her? He asked, somewhat afraid of the answers. The doctor cleared his throat, his demeanor changing completely, but then a smile split his face. She will be fine. She's resting now, still weak from the blood lost, but you can go see her in a while. Matthew was left speechless after the information, too joyfully dumbfounded to even utter a word. His mouth was agape, his eyes wide as the pressure that had seemingly been resting on his chest eased. So she's all right? He choked. The doctor nodded with a smile. She will be. Congratulations on your baby boy, he exclaimed before stepping off. For some passing seconds, Matthew still stood there, too overwhelmed to move, but when John Mayhew pulled him in for a hug, he gave in to his joy, hugging his father tightly as the tears of joy fell from his eyes. I have a baby boy, and Kaylyn, he whispered against his father's neck, repeating the words until he laughed at how happy it made him feel hearing the sudden ruckus. Sapphire stirred in her grandmother's arms, muttering a barely audible, "Dad?" Matthew tore himself apart from his father and took Sapphire from Rachel's arms. She was now staring at him with cloudy eyes. "Daddy, what's wrong?" she asked in a muffled tone. Matthew was grinning. "Kaylyn is all right, and you have a baby brother," he chirped mirthfully. Sapphire smiled as she rubbed the sleep from her eyes. But boys are gross," she announced, earning laughs from everyone in the room. Matthew pulled her against his chest as he laughed, reveling in the fact that this was the best moment in his life. He couldn't wait to see his baby. He couldn't wait to see Kaylyn. Chapter 45. The doctor had wisely suggested that the family give Kaylyn some time to rest, but boy, Matthew was anxious. He was tempted to ask the doctor just how long was some time, but upon further contemplation, he had decided that he was probably right. Kaylyn needed the rest, especially after losing so much blood. He wouldn't mind seeing her though, just watching her rest, he wouldn't mind that at all. He just wanted proof that he had not suffered from a replicated fate. Kaylyn had not left him, she had fought like Patrick and Faith had said she would. She lived for life, and the very thought made Matthew's heart soar with happiness. The sadness that had been so evident in everyone's eyes earlier was now replaced with unfathomable joy. Prayers were answered, faith was kept, and the result was astounding. Tears fell from his eyes, but they were not from the cause of the doubt that she may or may not have made it. He truly understood the meaning of tears of joy in this given situation. His happiness was an understatement. Matthew spotted Patrick. He had his hands palms out on the wall, his body trembling as he too reveled in the immeasurable joy that now consumed his body. Matthew moved towards him, gently placing a hand on his frigid shoulders. He immediately turned with tears in his eyes, but a smile was etched on his face. "My baby girl made it, Matthew, I knew she would." He trailed off and pulled Matthew in his arms, body still being racked with tremors. "I told you she was a fighter." Matthew grinned, patting the man on his shoulders. "Like her father." Patrick suddenly pulled apart and forced a smile. "Aren't you going to take a look at your baby boy?" he asked, watching the way Matthew's eyes brightened at the mention of his son. "Of course. I wonder what he looks like," he laughed. "He'll look like the most beautiful thing you've ever seen." Patrick smiled. "He'll look like Kaylyn then," he concluded with a chuckle, earning one from Patrick as well. An hour later, Matthew was escorted by a doctor to the incubatory. He was adorned in protective clothing given to him by the doctor to protect the baby from any possible bacteria. Matthew held a grin on his face the whole time, picturing a few possible ways in which the baby would look. He came to the conclusion that with his evident good looks and Kaylyn's beauty, he would be perfect. His smile slightly faltered when the doctor directed him towards a small little thing harnessed in the small glass container. His little body was barely visible beneath the strings and machines attached to him. Tears welled in Matthew's eyes, but before they got a chance to fall, a reassuring hand was placed on his shoulder. "Don't worry," the doctor began. "This one's a fighter, he'll be out of here in no time." Matthew nodded, managing a smile. He moved closer, leaning in to carefully examine the life he had created. "I'll just be outside," the doctor put in, patting Matthew on the shoulder. He nodded quickly, before bringing his gaze back to the baby. "Hey there, little guy," he whispered, smiling when he noted the scanty red hair that sprung from his small head. "He is Kaylyn's hair," Matthew concluded joyfully, a slow grin splitting his face. His face was pink and chubby with a straight little nose and pinched rose-red lips. He was unable to see his eyes, because he was asleep. Gingerly, he reached down and placed his index finger between small fingers. "Thank you for being brave and strong for me today," he smiled, using his thumb to caress the soft flesh of the baby's hand. "I can't wait until you meet your mommy," Matthew continued. "She'll be the most amazing person you will ever meet, trust me." He continued to talk, not minding the silent replies he got. When small fingers gently tightened around Matthew's finger, he suddenly knew that today was possibly the best of his life. Life was present. It demanded to be lived. Patrick sat in the waiting area still, reveling in the happiness that seemed tangible around him. His daughter would be fine, and so would his grandson, even with the fact that he wouldn't be, he was contented. Timidly, Patrick reached into his pocket and fished out his phone, tapping it against his knee and pondering over the possibility of calling Lilith. She would probably shrug off the information like an old coat, but Patrick decided that she probably deserved to know. His pulse quickened as he dialed the number, and with one last pause, he sent out the call. It rang 2 times, before Patrick decided to hang up, thinking it was a waste of time, but as he was about to bring it from his ear, he heard, "Hello." His mouth salivated. "Lilith." "Patrick?" She seemed surprised. "What prompted this call?" she asked in her usual poised manner. Patrick sighed lightly. "It's a boy." "What's a Patrick, what are you talking about?" She answered with a tinge of frustration tainting her voice. "Kaylyn's baby," Patrick provided. "It's a boy." Silence greeted them, with an anxious anticipation for her reply. "I just called to let you know," Patrick continued. "They're both fine, although Kaylyn lost a lot of blood and the baby was low on oxygen. They made it," he spoke, and although his partner in the conversation was Lilith, speaking of life made him happy. Lilith cleared her throat and Patrick braced himself for the reply. "Have you seen them?" she surprisingly asked. Patrick was somewhat shocked. He wasn't expecting that reply. No, not yet. Matthew has gone to see the baby whilst giving Kaylyn some time to rest. She needs the rest, so we are giving her some time before we." Lilith knew Patrick was babbling. He did so when he was caught off guard with a question or when he was nervous. "Patrick." He stopped abruptly. "I've had some time to think about what you said to me." Patrick's eyes widened, his breath hitched. "I didn't take your illness seriously until I called your doctor." A sob broke away from her. Patrick's eyes widened. "He told me everything," she exclaimed brokenly. Patrick tightly closed his eyes. "I'm so sorry for not believing you and not being there for you," she cried, but quickly sniffed and cleared her throat, welcoming her cool demeanor. I was planning on calling you, but I was afraid of facing the reality of it. Lilith," Patrick cut in firmly. "Yes? You don't have to apologize to me." "I can't imagine how hard it must be for you," came the curt reply. Lilith inhaled deeply. "I'm trying, Patrick. I'm not proud of the things I've done or my character. I think we both know that I'm really not the person you should be apologizing to." They were once again consumed in companionable silence. "I've got to go, Matthew is coming." "Goodbye, Lilith," he said, and without awaiting a reply, he disconnected the call, heaving a sigh. Lilith was not big on emotions. In fact, Patrick had found her apology shocking, not knowing if it resulted from genuine regret or a falsified attempt at trying to shy away from the cold, heartless person she really was. Whether she wanted to make things right or not, Patrick was seemingly uninterested. He would use the time God had spared him to spend some time with his daughter and grandson. He stood when he saw Matthew approaching, smiling when he saw the happiness on the man's face. He addressed them all. "He has Kaylyn's hair and lips," he announced brightly, earning a chorus of approving replies. "I bet he has your eyes," Rachel put in lovingly. "He was asleep, so I was unable to see them," he grinned. John proudly patted him on the shoulders. "I better go see Kaylyn now." Matthew slowly opened the door where he saw Kaylyn nestled on the small bed with covers drawn up to her chest. He walked slowly to her side, carefully examining her ashen features that created a stark contrast beneath her thick flowing mass of fiery red hair. Even with a snow-white, ghastly complexion, her beauty was still intact, and Matthew couldn't help but think she looked like Sleeping Beauty with flaming red hair. Taking a seat on a nearby chair, he drew closer to Kaylyn, immediately reaching for her hand. He graced it with a gentle kiss, before smiling. "You gave us quite a scare back there," he began, then went silent, trying to find within himself the words he wanted to say. "But you fought for yourself, the baby, for Saf, your father." Matthew cleared his throat, gently caressing her hand. "And I'd like to think that you fought for us too," he smiled shyly, amidst the fact that Kaylyn wasn't looking at him. She was asleep and possibly oblivious of what he was saying. It was so much easier not seeing her dazzling gray eyes that would have him at a loss for words. But Matthew also realized that he would have to say these exact words when she was awake. He considered this practice. After Marcia, I didn't think I was capable of caring for anyone like I cared for her. But fate taught me how wrong I was when I went into the club that night, and I hadn't realized it then, but 3 months later I started being myself again, and I still didn't realize it then either." He gave a soft chuckle. "But when you were always occupying my thoughts and my heart broke when I saw your tears and soared I heard your laugh, I knew what my heart was feeling. I was sure after. As sure as a beach," he chuckled, remembering what Kaylyn had said to him in her drunken state when they had met each other at the club. "The point I'm trying to make here is that I love you, Kaylyn Fisher." Completely, genuinely, and wholeheartedly, he finally admitted softly, his heart suddenly feeling lighter. He felt a gentle squeeze to his hand, and Matthew looked up, shocked. Kaylyn's eyes were slightly opened, looking down at him while a small smile tugged her lips. Matthew was flabbergasted. You heard?" A wide-eyed Matthew asked. Kaylyn slowly nodded and swallowed hard before replying. "I heard everything," she admitted, sounding a bit weak. Matthew went pale, his eyes searching. "It's completely fine if you don't return my feelings. I understand, but I just want you to know that I meant every single word. I do, but I understand if Matthew." Kaylyn smiled, silencing him. "Yeah?" The word came out short and breathless. "I love you too," she grinned. Completely, genuinely, wholeheartedly. It took Matthew a short while to process the words spoken, but when he did, his eyes widened, his mouth dropping open. "You do," he wanted confirmation to the words that seemed too good to be true. She nodded this time, and as she did, Matthew leapt up from his chair and hugged her awkwardly, placing a kiss on her forehead in the process. Kaylyn laughed. "I thought I lost you," he told her softly. "For a while, I thought I lost you too." Matthew smiled. "Have you seen him?" "The doctor told me he was incubated, but he'll be fine though." "I'm dying to see him," she said while tears welled up in her eyes. "I saw him," Matthew informed. "He's so tiny and he has your hair and lips," he added joyfully. Kaylyn laughed at the news. "And your eyes?" she asked, as a tear slipped from her eyes. Matthew reached up, using a thumb to caress her cheek. "I'd like to think so, but he was asleep." Kaylyn nodded comprehensively. "Is Sapphire okay?" "She is, and so is Faith and your dad," he informed without her having to ask. "I'm glad Dad's going to get a chance to see his grandbaby," she sniffed. A short silence followed. Have you decided on a name for the baby? Matthew asked. I was thinking my dad's middle name and your middle name, which is your father's name, so. Josiah Jonathan Mayhew. What do you think? Matthew flashed a grin. I love it. She smiled, and so did Matthew, the love swimming in both their eyes, completely, genuinely, and wholeheartedly true. Chapter 46. The day had finally come for Kaylyn to see the baby. The doctors had advised her to give it some time, despite her eagerness. She was recovering from surgery and the baby was still premature, meaning none was really fit enough to see the other, but boy Kaylyn was anxious as well as nervous. Matthew was at her side, waiting for the doctor to escort them to the NICU where baby Josiah was. What if he doesn't like me? Kaylyn asked Matthew, who could not stop smiling. He chuckled at her question. Why wouldn't he? He asked. Everything will be fine, he reassured softly. Sure. Positive. Kaylyn smiled meekly before the nurse entered with a wheelchair leading the way. Kaylyn's brows furrowed, wondering why she needed a wheelchair. She wasn't paralyzed and she was able to walk just fine, and she planned on telling the woman that. I'm perfectly capable of helping myself, she cut in before the woman had a chance to say anything. She only smiled as she came nearer. This is just basic procedure, ma'am, and I'm sure you'll need the assistance after the surgery you've had. Kaylyn sighed as she glanced at the wheelchair, knowing that the woman's words were true, but she just didn't quite see herself in a wheelchair at her age. Okay, well, as long as I'm able to see my baby, fine then. She announced, earning a smile from both Matthew and the nurse, who seemed to be in her 20s. Kaylyn eased herself up, with Matthew and the woman at her side ready to assist her. As soon as she swung her legs over the edge of the small bed, she instantly understood the reason for the wheelchair. She felt numb and achy in some places, not being able to resist the scowl that formed on her face. Take it slow and easy, the nurse advised, taking Kaylyn by one arm, but it wasn't doing Kaylyn any good. It irritated her for feeling so damn useless. Matthew, as if reading her mind, swept her into his arms and gently placed her in the chair. Kaylyn couldn't resist a smile after, neither could the nurse. Well, thank you. Don't mention it, Matthew smiled as they moved towards the room the baby was in. In a room filled with crying babies, the doctor directed them towards one particular baby who was nestled in a glass container at the far end. Before they could enter though, Kaylyn had to sanitize her hands thoroughly so that the baby could not pick up any germs with contact. Kaylyn slowly stood, and as soon as she saw her bundle of joy, she forgot about the dull ache below her stomach, because all that mattered was what her eyes were giving her the privilege of seeing. Tears welled in her eyes instantaneously, and with a blink, they fell, reminding Kaylyn that tears didn't have to be sad to fall. As she feasted her eyes on the tiny little baby, a mixture of overwhelming emotions consumed her. Despite his tiny little body that seemed too small for the equipment attached to him and the heaving of his small chest, Kaylyn was grateful he was alive, because when the possibility of death had been like a dark cloud over their heads a few days ago, life was greatly appreciated now, regardless of how small it seemed. He's so small, she whispered, eyes never leaving the baby. Matthew smiled, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Imagine the balls he will be hitting in a few years. This one's a fighter. Matthew expelled proudly, and of course when he'd first seen the baby, he had thought the same thing, but Kaylyn needed the hope. She smiled, placing a gentle hand on his small chest, feeling the beating of his small heart. She then used her fingers to trail along the soft scanty hair that sprouted up from his small head. He stirred and Kaylyn softly gasped from the unexpectedness of it. His eyes then slowly fluttered open and Kaylyn was befuddled by the beauty of it. It seemed like a dark green with the whitest scara, but before Kaylyn could confirm the color, it closed again. When can I get to hold him? Kaylyn asked, brushing away the tears from her face. The nurse, who was close by, offered her a reply. Hopefully in a few days when he is strong enough to be taken out of here, he informed. Some babies take a longer time, but he is responding well to his treatments. Kaylyn nodded contentedly before she managed a shaky smile. She had never thought she'd have to wait to see her baby, but then again, at one point she didn't think she'd hold him at all. She leaned into Matthew's chest and he held her there, placing a kiss on her forehead as they watched their child like he was treasure. Seeing that they could not see the baby for a few days, Sapphire and the others went home. The Mayhews were at Matthew's caring for Sapphire while Matthew was at the hospital. He only came home to shower and check on Sapphire before he'd leave again for the hospital before Kaylyn would wake up and find that he wasn't by her side. "When are they coming home, Grandma?" Sapphire asked one morning as Rachel was getting her ready for school. "I'm not sure, honey. They both need time to get well before they can come home," Rachel informed. "But Dad isn't sick, why can't he stay here?" Sapphire questioned. Rachel sighed with a smile. "Kaylyn and the baby need your father's support, honey." "Oh," came the flat reply as she sadly hung her head. Rachel knew what might have caused Sapphire's sadness. She was feeling jealous and left out at the sudden lack of attention she received. "Honey, aren't you happy to be a big sister?" Rachel asked. "I don't know anymore," she pouted. Rachel knelt before her, holding her small hands in hers. "Honey, think of how wonderful it'll be. You'll be in charge of someone." Rachel raised a brow. "When he's mad at Kaylyn or Matthew, he'll run to you for support. He'll look up to you and he'll love you, you just see," she winked before continuing. "He'll depend on you to love and dash, but I don't want to love him if he takes Kaylyn and Daddy from me," Sapphire interjected sharply. "He won't take them from you, sweetheart. He's just not well, and so he'll need all the love and care he can get for now." Sapphire was silent for a while. "Okay, I'll love him then, but I don't know if I can protect him yet, Grandma. I mean, I'm just 5, she exclaimed with a giggle. Rachel laughed heartily, while she shook her head. Chapter 47. At 2 weeks of seemingly unending tests on both Kaylyn and the baby, they were both cleared to go home. Kaylyn thought it was the longest and most unnerving time of her life, but the fact that they both made it out fine was something to be happy about. Matthew was ready, of course, to bring them home after his many visits to the hospital over the past weeks. Kaylyn was holding the baby who had strived so much. No longer was he so small and wrinkly, but his face had filled out and his color was no longer gloomy. His hair grew too, kindles of soft fire on pristine skin. Small freckles sprinkled across his little nose, and dark green eyes like Matthew's. Kaylyn held him closely and carefully, loving the way he felt in her arms. "Ready to finally go home, little guy?" Matthew softly asked, gently shaking his hands. He cooed and stirred, snuggling up to Kaylyn, who smiled from the sheer joy of just looking at the baby. Matthew smiled too, as he kissed Kaylyn on the cheek before grabbing her things. Who knew smiles could be permanent? He thought contentedly. As soon as they arrived home, Sapphire was already in the garage, waiting eagerly for them to get out so she could grace them with her presence. Rachel had scoured her clean prior to their arrival, advising Sapphire that she had to be spotless clean to see the baby. After getting out and taking the baby from Kaylyn, she got out and Sapphire was already hugging her legs tightly. "Kaylyn!" she squealed excitedly. "I missed you so much." Kaylyn smiled, able to relate Sapphire's excitement. "I missed you too." She gently used her hands to smoothen her hair before stopping to meet her eyes. "I'm so happy to be home." Kaylyn pulled Sapphire in her arms for a hug, breathing her crisply fresh scent. Sapphire smiled. "Can I see the baby?" she asked eagerly. "Sure, just as soon as I put him to sleep," she winked and Sapphire nodded profusely. Sapphire chatted with them all the way to the nursery, filling Kaylyn in on every bit that happened while she was in the hospital, including the fresh food her grandparents prepared and how early they made her go to bed. Of course, she made Kaylyn laugh as she always did. Josiah was sleeping when Kaylyn placed him in the crib, all wrapped in blankets, with stuffed animals at his feet. Sapphire was in awe as she stared down at her brother for the first time. "Wow, was I that small, Dad?" she asked with her eyes not leaving. "Josiah." Matthew chuckled. "You were," he confirmed proudly. "Wow. I've never seen people so small before," she said so low it seemed like a whisper. Kaylyn was grinning so hard and Matthew was right beside her, trying to contain his laughter. And he's so pink, and she turned to Matthew. Dad, he's not gonna be so hard to protect after all, she smiled with crossed arms. Seeing that they looked a bit confused, she continued. Grandma told me I will have to protect him and care for him. It's not going to be hard. He's so small. Honey, he's gonna grow, Matthew began, but Sapphire didn't give him time to finish. It will be like a doll, but this one poops and cries. I can manage, she shrugged. Are you sure, honey? Matthew teased. It's actually harder than it looks. Sapphire rolled her eyes and sighed frustratingly. Plus, I'm gonna have my own little people someday, Daddy. I better start practicing, she exclaimed as she strolled to the door. Matthew's mouth fell open as a laugh bubbled up from within him. I'm gonna wash my hands again, then I'm coming back, she informed before disappearing around a corner. Matthew and Kaylyn burst out laughing. I think she's way beyond her years, Kaylyn said, laughter evident in her voice. Matthew nodded in agreement and then there was a small silence. Are you okay? He asked her. Kaylyn immediately nodded. Never better, she reassured before Matthew reached out to kiss her softly on the lips. In the late evening when Matthew was downstairs conversing with his parents, Faith and Kaylyn were upstairs doing the same. Ah, I can't believe you actually have a baby, she chirped, glancing every now and then to Josiah's crib. She already loved the bundle of joy. Kaylyn scoffed. Yeah, I mean, after I broke things off with Marcus, I thought me having a child would be somewhat far-fetched, she admitted softly. Faith cleared her throat. Speaking of, did he ever call or? She trailed off and shrugged. Not once. Kaylyn informed, suddenly finding it strange that he hadn't. He. Faith began, scratching her head nervously. What is it? Kaylyn prodded. He came to my place a week after you had moved in with Matthew, she continued, ignoring Kaylyn's gasp. Said you weren't at your apartment and he had lost his phone and your number, so he couldn't get a hold of you. I told him you reacquainted with your parents and moved to Jamaica. Kaylyn was shocked. Well, why? Why didn't you tell me? Look, I knew Marcus' re-entry into your life would only cause problems. I didn't want you dealing with his overbearing ass, so I sent him on his way. Faith explained. Kaylyn shook her head, and then smiled. Well, thank you. Faith's eyes widened. So you aren't mad? Of course not, she exclaimed. You're right, he would only cause problems, and I'm glad things worked out the way they did. Going to that club is the best thing that happened to me, Faith. I would never have met Matt or Saf, even Dad. If Catherine hadn't set up that ridiculous plan to lure them here in order to embarrass me, I probably wouldn't have made amends with Dad. I wouldn't be as happy as I am now. Faith smiled. I'm so happy for you. Her words were sincere and genuine, and Kaylyn wished for the same happiness for her friend. A soft knock sounded at the door, and Kaylyn turned to find Matthew. Hey, he smiled her way and she smiled back. Hey. Your dad is downstairs. He wants to see you, Matthew informed, and Kaylyn grinned. She long awaited to see her dad. Send him up, she quickly said. Matthew cleared his throat. He doesn't think he should be in close proximity to the baby just yet, considering Josiah's a striving preemie and he's sick. Kaylyn's smile fell, and so did her heart, but she bravely cleared her throat and nodded her head. Okay. She got up from her chair. Just keep an eye on the baby until I get back, she said to no one in particular. Kaylyn descended the stairs, pausing in the middle when she saw her dad waiting for her at the bottom. Dad, she whispered. Her lips trembled into a smile as she dashed towards him, enveloping him into a loving hug. So happy to see you, she said against the crook of his neck. Patrick's feeling was mutual, and the hug they shared spoke of such. They pulled apart and went into the sitting area where Kaylyn poured him a glass of water before they could begin their conversation. How's the little guy doing? He began cheerfully. At the mention of her son, Kaylyn smiled. He's fine. He's sleeping now, but he'll be fine, she informed. Patrick nodded. Good. There was a small silence. This might not be the best time to bring this up, he began. But Lilith and I have been in contact over the past weeks. He sighed and continued despite Kaylyn's shock. Honey, if she ever comes here, asking for some kind of Dad, Kaylyn, listen to me. Life is too short to spend it with a heavy heart and an unforgiving soul. I know it may be hard, but the best choices in life are never easy. In order for you to live happily, knowing that you have a clean slate, you must do what's right. Daddy, please reconsider what you are asking of me, Kaylyn pleaded, knowing that what her father was asking of her was somewhat impossible. Lilith Fisher had not only hurt her, but her father as well, who she abandoned because he chose to side with Kaylyn. Just give your relationship a chance before it's too late, I beg of you, Patrick pleaded, and Kaylyn was left to ponder on what he was saying. Chapter 48. The thing with life is that it can be so glorious until it decides to go on without someone you love. After spending 2 months with his grandson and reveling in some of the best experiences of his life, Patrick died in his apartment while watching old video clips of Kaylyn's childhood. He laughed and he cried at the memories until his heart could do nothing but weep at the lack of life that it suddenly possessed. Kaylyn had been in the kitchen then, preparing his favorite, pot roast. When she no longer heard his jubilant laughs or the cheerful stomps of his feet, she had grown worried, immediately rushing in to see what was wrong. He had seemed to be only sleeping to her, but she knew that this sleep he had wandered into was more permanent than temporary. She had cried, shaking him to see if he was playing with her or if he was asleep. But when she cried and called his name repeatedly, silence told her it was no joke. The only day she had decided to spend with her father, only them, and he had chosen to leave her, or rather, the Lord had decided that it was time to bring an angel home. Now it was the day of his funeral, and everything was that of pure gloom. Black dresses, black suits, black shades, and the black holes in saddened hearts. Tears seemed never ending since the day of his death, and the days seemed to be at a standstill, seemingly unmoving and not quite believing that death had knocked, entered, and took without giving the family of the bereaved time to say goodbye. But what was good about saying bye anyway, when you would no longer see the ones you loved? And it was in that instant did they really understand death, now that it placed its hand on someone they loved. Kaylyn took a glance at his father for the last time, until the casket closed and his body lowered into the neatly dug hole they had placed in the ground. A ground Kaylyn wished would pull her through and give her a burial of her own, because she hurt too much. Matthew was by her side, his hand wrapped around her shoulders, holding her fragile body to him while he tried to hold himself together. The funeral was small, but Kaylyn wasn't really sure because her eyes had seemed strained on one spot, and that was the image of her father in a polished wooden container, dressed in a suit like he was going somewhere. Heaven probably? When his casket touched the bottom of the ground and they began to cover it with dirt, Kaylyn could no longer watch. She choked a sob and buried herself in Matthew's chest while she cried. Matthew held her to him like she was life itself, despite the death that hovered in the air. When all was over and everyone hugged Kaylyn with their genuine condolences, Kaylyn, and Matthew too, decided to go home. As soon as they moved towards the car, Kaylyn spotted a woman, talking with a few friends of her father. Her breath hitched in her throat when she was able to make out a few features on the woman. She was dressed in black, pure black, hat, dress, shoes, and shades, and despite the fragile occasion of death, she was still able to maintain a ramrod-straight posture and unwavering composure. Kaylyn had called her a few days after Patrick's death to inform her of the unfortunate circumstances, but the phone had went to voicemail, thus leaving Kaylyn with no other option but to leave a message. She didn't call back and Kaylyn didn't understand why. But what was there to understand when it came to Lilith Fisher? Matthew, seeing the direction in which her eyes traveled, realized what, or rather whom, she was looking at. "What do you want to do?" Matthew asked softly. "We can go home if you want," he said, knowing that Kaylyn's heart must have been breaking more with the sight of her mother. Kaylyn swallowed hard, her gaze fixated on Lilith. Yeah, let's go, she croaked. Home would make her feel better. Seeing Josiah and Sapphire would make her feel better. Her mother wouldn't. They moved towards the car, Kaylyn blanching when she heard her name. She stopped, closing her eyes tightly when her brain registered the name. It was Lilith. She stood rooted in one spot, her hands balled into fists, not from anger, but from trying to compose herself. Kaylyn, she called again, and very soon, they were standing face to face. Lilith no longer had her shades on, and so her wrinkle-edged blue eyes was surprisingly filled with hurt, red and teary. Kaylyn could not formulate a reply in that instant. All she could do was stare at the woman she had vowed to hate for the rest of her life. But somehow hate was not the first emotion she felt while staring at her, and in that moment Kaylyn wondered if it was her first time seeing her mother cry. That unwavering composure that she seemed to achieve just moments ago came crashing down like magnet to iron. Her thin red lips trembled, and soon after, a loud sob broke away from her lips. Kaylyn wanted so badly to leave her in that very spot crying her heart out, but her own heart could not give her permission, and so regardless of the grudges and dislike that she carried for the woman, she cried too, joining in the sorrow of the loved one they both lost. "I'm sorry," Lilith wailed, and as Kaylyn built the walls around her heart, with each brick and the cementation of mortar, they came crumbling down, leaving the fragile vessel exposed to grief. They were both staring at each other with tears making a trail of salted sadness down their faces. Finally, when both stubborn wills were broken, they had no choice but to succumb to each other's embrace. They stood there in that position for some passing seconds, before Kaylyn pulled apart. "We've got to talk." Matthew gave them time alone, while he went to sit in the car and check up on the kids. Lilith and Kaylyn were both seated on a small bench, close to the cemetery. For some passing time, no one spoke, until Lilith finally did so. I haven't been the best wife or mother over the years," she began, and Kaylyn knew she wouldn't disagree with her on that. "I'm not proud of most the things I've done, Kaylyn. I was selfish and concerned about my own self, but you've got to believe me when I say I love you and Patrick." "I don't." Kaylyn cut in sharply, not wanting to sound so harsh, but realized it couldn't be stopped. Her father's pleas were the adhesive that was holding her to the chair, allowing her to listen to her. "I truly do, but I allowed my pride and my selfishness to get in the way of expressing how I really felt. You are my mother, and you believed a neighbor over your own child who was almost raped in her own home," Kaylyn spat with mounting anger. Lilith sniffed. "And I'm sorry, Kaylyn, that's all I can say at this point." Kaylyn scoffed. "What's the point of sorry when the damage is already done?" Lilith was left silent. "I'm sure Dad told you he was sick, so why didn't you come to visit him?" she asked, continuing without giving Lilith the chance to answer the first question. "He waited for you every day, and in spite of your evilness, he still loved and defended you, and he's dead, and now you decide to come?" She spat in disgust, newly formed tears running down her face. "Doesn't it kill you?" she continued with enough venom in her voice to strike down a snake. "He died and you weren't there, his wife." Kaylyn angrily brushed the tears from her face as she sprung from the bench. "Why are you even here, Mom?" she asked, wiping her mouth and hugging her shoulders. "Kaylyn, please, please what?" she yelled. "Forgive you," she completed with the highest degree of disgust. Lilith was crying, profusely, her body slightly trembling. Kaylyn swallowed. "You heard my message about Dad's death and you still didn't contact me. You didn't ask about his funeral arrangements, you didn't even call to see how I was managing it all." Her words are soft now. "I was heartbroken, Kaylyn." Kaylyn snorted. "So you admit you have a heart then?" Lilith momentarily closed her eyes. "When I heard your message, I didn't want to believe it was true. In fact, I didn't believe it at all. I spent days trying to come to terms with the reality of his death, and when I did, I was scared. I was afraid of this, I was afraid of actually talking to you, because I know I'm not worthy of forgiveness, and I know deep down that you must wish it was me in the ground instead. And I wish that was the case too, because I caused you both so much hurt and pain. I watched as he silently cried in our room when you left. He prayed every night for the Lord to bring you back home safely, and I prevented it, and I'm sorry," she wailed. "I'm sorry for taking those years from you. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. I'm sorry I wasn't a mother to you." She fell to her knees before Kaylyn, who stiffened. "I'm so sorry, Kaylyn, I'm so sorry," she cried, hands wrapped around Kaylyn's leg. She shrugged out of her hold. "I have 2 kids now," she croaked. "A little boy who makes me happy just by being there and a girl who is intelligent as well as funny. They make me happy. That man waiting for me in the car makes me happy, and I wonder, does it kill you?" Lilith was sobbing even more, and Kaylyn watched with a face void of emotions, but her lips were trembling and tears ran from her eyes. She suddenly remembered her father's words, what he had said months ago. "Kaylyn, listen to me. Life is too short to spend it with a heavy heart and an unforgiving soul. I know it may be hard, but the best choices in life are never easy. In order for you to live happily, knowing that you have a clean slate, you must do what's right." The tears seemed to flow heavier at his words, and Kaylyn raked her hands through her hair in frustration. Lilith stood from the ground with the tears streaming down her face. Kaylyn, please, I'm willing to change, I'm willing to do anything to gain your forgiveness, and I know it will take time, but I'll wait," she sniffed, holding Kaylyn's hands. She felt the resistance, but she didn't let it go. "Just give your relationship a chance before it's too late, I beg of you." Kaylyn cleared her throat. "I'm willing to try for Dad," she said. "Forgiveness won't come easy, but that's the price you pay for what you've done." Lilith nodded, a smile shaking her lips as joy flooded her body. She pulled Kaylyn in her arms, and despite herself, Kaylyn didn't pull apart. She allowed it. Glancing in the direction of her father's grave, she thought, in life, there is death, and in death, there is another life. While happiness may have seemed scarce in some point of her life, it reminded her that she lived no fairy tale. There were no happy endings weren't happy, but she planned on making her in-between one she lived to the fullest. Life was too unexpected and short to spend it holding on to long-ass grudges and screwed faces. Kaylyn, in that moment, made a vow that she was going to be happy. She was going to live until life could no longer accommodate her. And so she did. Epilogue. Kaylyn and Matthew both flung the covers over their heads, breathing heavily and in between laughs. "Wow, that was amazing," she breathed out, staring at the white ceiling while she tried to catch her breath. Matthew chuckled. "Better than the first, don't you think?" he asked, still in awe with the feelings he had experienced just moments ago. "Of course," Kaylyn choked out suddenly. The first wasn't in near competition to the sheer pleasure that they both just shared. Drunk with a hazy mind did not come close to sober, in love and passionate. Matthew turned to his side, reaching for Kaylyn once more as he kissed her soft lips again, the sweetness of it causing a wave of emotion to bolt through him. He withdrew and brought his mouth to her chest. He kissed her breast. "Can go," moving to her neck. Another round, he finally reached her lips and she grinned her reply. "Matt, the kids will be awake soon and he silenced her with a kiss, and the passion that it carried soon had Kaylyn forgetting what she had earlier said. "Mom. Dad." Sapphire's voice came, causing Matthew and Kaylyn to stiffen. Kaylyn still smiled, hearing Sapphire call her mom. It was a few months after her father's funeral when she had asked to privately talk with Kaylyn. "Kaylyn, may I ask you something?" she had asked when they were alone. Sapphire had seemed surprisingly shy, and Kaylyn was a bit concerned about it. "Sure," she had quickly said. Sapphire fidgeted with her fingers, her head lowered on the task while she nervously twisted her mouth. "One day Josiah will call you mommy, so She trailed off with a sigh. "If you say no, I will be okay with it." "Sapphire, what is it?" Kaylyn prodded, already sensing where the conversation was headed, and boy, her heart was already swimming with joy. "Can you be my mommy too?" she blurted. Kaylyn laughed, suddenly teary-eyed. "Honey, you didn't have to ask, I took the job a long time ago." Sapphire beamed. "So I can call you mommy then?" Kaylyn had cried before pulling her into her arms. Of course. Hey, she heard Matthew's voice and halted herself from her thoughts. Yeah, she asked, searching his face. Come on, get dressed. If Sapphire doesn't see us, she will come bolting in here, and quite frankly, I don't have any holy water to put in her eyes when she sees us like this, he exclaimed between laughs. Kaylyn grinned. Oh, I'm sorry, I just can't get used to the sound of mommy, she admitted. Matthew smiled as he placed a swift kiss on her lips. Come on. They both quickly got dressed and went into the living room, where they found Sapphire and Josiah. They were both in their pajamas and seated on the sofa. Seeing them, Sapphire immediately got up and ran to the opposite side of Josiah, just a few inches away. Saph, what's going on? Matthew asked curiously. Just watch, was all she said before bringing her gaze back to her little brother. No longer was he the fragile little baby that had to stay in the hospital for months, but he had grown into a cute boy with curly orange hair, snow-white complexion and big green eyes that was flattered by thick long lashes. Come on Jay, Sapphire called on bended knees, lightly clapping her hands in encouragement. Come on baby, it's time to show mom and dad what you can do now. Kaylyn and Matthew's brows furrowed, as they watched, wondering what was going on. Kaylyn slapped her hands over her mouth when Josiah took the first step, wobbling in the process, but he did not fall. Oh my, Matthew said in awe as he quickly skidded from the room, almost instantly returning with his video camera in hand. Josiah took another determined step, but this time he fell on his hands, making Kaylyn gasp. He quickly got back up and laughed with drool running down his red lips, before he continued. Sapphire laughed too, and when he reached where she was, she pulled him into her arms for a hug. You did it. She grinned, kissing him all over the face. Josiah expelled a screeching laugh, pulling at her sister's hair. Matthew and Kaylyn were still in awe at what had transpired before their eyes. Kaylyn moved forward and hugged them both, placing firm kisses on their foreheads, while Matthew was recording the scene with undeniable happiness. They all reveled in the feeling for some passing seconds, all taking turns to express their love for the other. The doorbell sounded, and everyone went quiet. I'll get it, Matthew said, already moving towards the door, while Kaylyn picked up Josiah, marching behind Sapphire who had gone to the kitchen. Matthew opened the door to find Jason. Hey man, they both slapped hands and patted each other on the back. Matthew peeked around the side, looking to see if Kaylyn or Sapphire was anywhere in sight. Did you get it? Matthew whispered, eagerness present in his voice. Jason nodded with a smile, pulling the small bag from inside his jacket and holding it up proudly. Thanks man, I owe you one, Matthew said, taking the bag from his hand and already rummaging through. He picked out the small black box and flicked it open, smiling broadly when he saw the beautiful diamond ring, cushioned in place. He had asked his friend to pick it up from the jewelry shop since he knew he wouldn't have much time. Matt, who dashed Kaylyn, rounded the corner asking, but stopped herself when she saw Jason. Jason, hey! Matthew quickly and nervously shoved the box in his pocket, allowing Jason to greet Kaylyn so he wouldn't seem at all suspicious. Kaylyn, you look lovely. As always, he said as he slightly hugged her and began to play with Josiah who was staring at him. Hey little guy, well aren't you growing fast, he grinned. Anyway, I was just in the neighborhood and decided to stop by and see if you guys were getting ready for the party. You know how the Mayhews are when it comes to tardiness, a brow shot up as he managed a strained smile. It's 8 a.m. Jace, Kaylyn pointed out. I don't think it will start anytime soon. We have a few hours to get ready. Oh, well He trailed off and scratched his head. I'll be heading back, so I'll see you later, he said, already moving towards the door. Patting Matt on the back, he gave a quick smile before leaving. Matthew shrugged. 6 hours later, the occupants of the Mayhew residence left their home and drove to Matthew's parents' house where the party would be held. It was an annual event put on to celebrate friends, family, and love. Matthew was nervous leaving the house, but now, being at the place where a single answer could possibly change his life forever, nervousness was proving to be an understatement. He went out of the driver's seat and stood, momentarily forgetting that he had not opened the door for Kaylyn. Muttering a soft curse, he quickly did so, managing a smile. He watched as Kaylyn smoothly slid out as graceful as a swan. Her royal blue, sequin dress did everything to emphasize her curves and long legs. Her hair was skillfully pinned, exposing a neck seemingly made for the tongue. Matthew scolded himself for the sudden direction in which his thoughts led him. "Are you okay?" Kaylyn asked. He smiled. "Perfect," he said, placing a kiss on her forehead. "You look absolutely stunning, by the way." She smiled, a blush warming her cheeks. "You don't look bad yourself." They went into the house, cheerfully greeting the guests who included Faith, the Mayhews, Jason and Lilith. The relationship between Kaylyn and Lilith was still awkward, but slowly they were learning to get along. "How are you?" Lilith asked timidly. "I'm well," she replied, and the conversation continued, Lilith taking her time to play with Josiah, who was laughing at the administered tickles. About an hour in the party, the music stopped and Matthew was at the DJ's with a mic in his hand. Kaylyn grew curious as she watched him nervously clear his throat. "I'll take Josiah," Rachel said, flashing Kaylyn a grin as she took the baby from her. "Hello everyone. Well, I've never done this before, so please excuse my nervousness." He laughed, licking his lips. "It has been almost 2 years since I met this particular woman and it has been like a roller coaster ride, honestly. But in that ride, I experienced a lot of things, frustration, anger, grief, happiness, and then there was one emotion, so powerful and strong that is now allowing me to stand here and say all these things. And that is love," he smiled, watching as the tears shimmered in Kaylyn's eyes with the lighting in the room and the way she used her hand to cover her mouth in order to hide her shock. Matthew continued. "I fell in love and I fell hard, and today I can't imagine my life without her or the happiness she has brought me and my family. I'm in love, and I'm in love with the feeling that it has brought me, and so today as I stand here with my heart hammering, I'd like to ask." He trailed off and slowly moved towards Kaylyn, who was shaking and crying and in disbelief. Matthew went on his knees, placed the mic on the floor and reached into his pocket, bringing out a small velvet box which he flicked open and placed before Kaylyn. "Kaylyn Elizabeth Fisher, will you make me the most relieved and happiest man alive by becoming my wife?" The entire room erupted at his question, but they quickly silenced to hear her reply. Matthew was a nervous wreck and Kaylyn was absolutely speechless and in awe, too overwhelmed to utter a reply right away. She was crying, and when the beauty of it all dawned on her, she laughed, stretching forth her hand as her happiness produced a reply. "Yes," she squealed. Yes, Matt." Matthew laughed and got up, pulling her into his arms, twirling her around and kissing her like his life depended on it. Chatter and glorious cheers erupted the room. "I love you, Matt," she said against his lips. Matthew grinned sheepishly. "Say it again," he whispered. "I love you, and I'll spend the rest of my life showing and telling you how much I do," she said, tears of joy still streaming down her face. "I love you too. I love you so much. Thank you for making me whole again," and with that he kissed her like they were the only ones in the room in the world. But then there was Sapphire, who squeezed through. "So can I be the flower girl then?" She grinned and they all laughed. With love there was no doubt involved, and they would prove that to be true for the rest of their lives with family and friends.